So we're going to switch gears here in chapter 4, and we're going to leave photosynthesis, and we're going to begin to talk about cellular respiration. This is section 4D. So our opening questions for section 4.7 is, all right, when we eat, what does burning calories really mean? Why do we even get hungry? And why do we need to breathe? So, one of the goals with understanding cellular respiration, aerobic cellular respiration, is why do we die when we don't have food? And why do we die when we don't have oxygen? In cellular respiration, oxygen is used to harvest the energy stored in sugar. Basically, in this process, what happens is we've already talked about that chemicals, that food are made up of chemicals, right? Things like carbohydrates or proteins or lipids, right? And remember, chemical energy is potential energy. It is stored energy. And the process of cellular respiration, that those chemical bonds in food are broken down, energy is released, and ATP is made so that the work of the cell can be done. And something to remember is all organisms, both producers and consumers, use cellular respiration. Now remember, cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria. It begins with oxygen and sugar. All right, so here we have the reactants. So sugar is broken down in the presence of oxygen, and carbon dioxide and water are released. So the products of cellular respiration are carbon dioxide and water, but also what's not indicated here that you'll see, oh, wait a second, I lied. It's right down here. And that is the other thing that is made during cellular respiration, which is the whole point of cellular respiration, is ATP is made. Okay. So once again, just remember, aerobic respiration occurs in both producers and consumers. I'd like to tie cellular respiration into physiology and just talking about respiration in the body. So you remember that oxygen is needed for cellular respiration, and we bring that oxygen in via the respiratory system, right? So, so oxygen is brought in, and CO2 at the end of cellular respiration are released. So we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. And that gas exchange is a very, basically is part of the respiratory system, right? Meanwhile, we take in food. Now that doesn't look like the healthiest food in the world, but it does have a lot of calories, certainly. So we take in food. The job of the digestive system is to break that food down, break those chemical bonds, and then have certain types of smaller molecules that can be used in cellular respiration to make the ATP that then can be used when we want to run or jump or think or whatever, right? We need ATP for that. So the chemical energy from food is going to provide the energy, but before we can actually use that energy, we need to make it in the form of ATP. So the ins and outs of aerobic respiration: oxygen travels from the lungs to the mitochondria, right? Food travels from the digestive system, via, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, to and then the circulatory system to the mitochondria. And then ultimately, after cellular respiration takes place and ATP is made, CO2 is released. It will leave the cell and then it will be expelled from the lungs. Now, for this to occur, there are 3 body systems that play a role in cellular respiration. So there is the respiratory system, the circulatory system, and the digestive system. So these 3 systems basically make it possible for mitochondria to have the building blocks it needs to make ATP. And of course, the most important is, oxygen, right? And fuel, for example, glucose. Now, energy is stored in the form of ATP, and that's because that's the form that the cell can use to do work. And remember, ATP is a high energy molecule. It has 3 phosphates, but basically cells move between ATP and ADP, okay? So ATP is higher energy, ADP is lower energy. To move from ADP to ATP, you need fuel, okay? That's why they're showing someone eating here. Then when you want to work out or move or think or whatever, you use up that ATP, it returns to ADP, and then you do the whole process all over again. You need, to break down fuel from food to actually make ATP. Then that ATP is used, you get back to ADP. And this process of going from ADP to ATP with energy added is the process of cellular respiration. So we've all looked at like nutrition labels with this idea of a calorie, right? So a calorie is just the amount of chemical energy stored in food. A nutrition label is really showing you kilocalories or thousands of calories, but it calls them calories just because it's easier. A calorie also can be described as the amount of energy burned. So this is kind of interesting that if you have like the energy from a hamburger that's like 557 calories, it would take about 2.2 hours of walking to actually, use up those calories. If you have a chocolate bar, that takes about 1 hour of walking to use up those calories. And 1 orange, about 0.2. So weight gain or loss is the result of calories in versus calories out. Now, when we start to talk about the details of cellular respiration, remember I wanted you to understand why is it that we die if we don't have food, and why is it we die when we don't have oxygen. So this is talking about if you've ever seen any of the old spy movies where a captured undercover agent, rather than spilling secrets, would swallow a hidden pill which resulted in instant death, which was very dramatic. Could such a pill really exist, and how could a poison work that fast? Well, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but basically that toxin, the poison, actually shuts down cellular respiration, and without that you don't have the energy you need to live. Cellular respiration is how life gets energy to power work. The purpose of cellular respiration is to make ATP. It does this in a way where oxygen is used to accept electrons from glucose. And the byproducts of cellular respiration are carbon dioxide and water. Now, both plants and animals depend on cellular respiration 24 hours a day, every second, in every cell. Okay? If the cell does not get what it needs for cellular respiration, that cell will die. Okay? When people have heart attacks, they are not getting blood to their heart muscle, and then they are not getting what they need for making ATP, and that heart muscle will die. Here's an overview of cellular respiration. 3 basic parts. There is glycolysis that occurs actually outside of the mitochondria, where glucose is split into 2 pyruvic acid molecules. There's the citric acid cycle, and then there's the electron transport chain. Okay. Now, I will say that this book does sort of simplify this last step. When you get to more upper level classes, we'll go into this more details of how the ATP is actually synthesized. But overall, glucose is broken down. High energy electrons are released and carried via NADH and FADH2 that ultimately then flows into the electron transport chain. And when it flows down the electron transport chain, energy is released, and that energy is used to synthesize ATP with the help of a really cool enzyme called ATP synthase. Also, along the way, small amounts of ATP are made in glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, but ultimately the largest amount of ATP is made in this last step. And remember, the citric acid cycle, the step 2 and step 3 occur in the mitochondria. Step 1 occurs outside of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm. So you definitely need to know the overall equation for cellular respiration, right? The reactants, glucose and oxygen, the products, carbon dioxide and water. And don't forget, very, very important, one thing I don't like about the way they do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration is they kind of put this kind of on the side like it's less important, but I mean, this is the goal of cellular respiration, is to make ATP that can be then used, it's the proper form for the cell to do work. So just a reminder that photosynthesis, remember, starts with carbon dioxide and water and makes glucose and releases oxygen. Cellular respiration starts with glucose and oxygen and then releases carbon dioxide and water. So the thing to remember is the reactants for photosynthesis ultimately are the products for cellular respiration. And the products of photosynthesis, oops, didn't do that very well, are the reactants for cellular respiration. So 3 stages of cellular respiration. Remember, glycolysis that occurs outside of the mitochondria, and then the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain that occurs inside the mitochondria. So we will start with the first part of cellular respiration, and that is glycolysis. So remember, glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. It begins with glucose, and it splits glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. In this process, a small amount of ATP is made. From there, we move on to the citric acid cycle. The citric acid cycle takes place in the mitochondria, in the mitochondrial fluid, which is the matrix. And in this process, pyruvic acid is broken down to CO2, high energy electrons are produced, and a small amount of ATP are produced. Now, we had talked about in photosynthesis electron carriers, the electron carrier of NADPH, and here are two more electron carriers, NADH and FADH2. So in this process, the citric acid cycle, there are electrons being picked up by these electron carriers, and as well as ATP being made. The last part is the electron transport chain, and I should say that in the process of the citric acid cycle, CO2 is released, and the electrons that are being carried by the electron carriers, NADH and FADH2, drop their electrons off into the electron transport chain. Okay, and then so high energy electrons move through the chain from high energy to low. Energy is released. The final electron acceptor, which I think is probably a review question for the electron transport chain, is oxygen. Oxygen picks up electrons and protons to form water, and in this process, lots of ATP are produced. Basically, when electrons pass down the electron transport chain, it creates what's called a proton gradient, and that is another form of potential energy that is then used to provide the energy for ATP to be made. And ATP is made with the help of this amazing enzyme called ATP synthase that actually synthesizes the ATP from ADP. So back to the spy pill that you would take if you were captured. The spy pills were made of potassium cyanide. You probably know cyanide is a very strong poison. The way it works is it actually interrupts the electron transport chain. And without those electrons flowing down the electron transport chain and then ultimately being picked up by oxygen to make water, the energy needed to make ATP does not happen because the electron flow has been stopped. And so ultimately, without that electron flow, ATP is not made. And the interesting thing is, you know, remember I wanted to ask you, well, how is it that, why do we die without oxygen? Sort of in a similar way, when we don't have oxygen, there is no final electron acceptor for the electrons flowing down the electron transport chain. And then what happens is the electron transport chain stops because there's nothing pulling those electrons, picking them up and making water so that that electron flow can continue. It kind of gets clogged up. And once that electron flow stops, because the oxygen isn't there taking the electrons away, the electron flow stops, energy is not released, and therefore ATP production stops. And so that's why, you know, it's not just cyanide that can cause us to die. If we don't have oxygen, right, that can cause us to die as well because ATP production stops.